This is Jessica Pettitt, and this is the first installment of a video series project that I invented about Project 2025. So I want to talk really briefly about why I invented it, and then I would like our guest to introduce herself as we are kicking off said project. And then we're going to talk about it. So I got really frustrated that for the first time since 1979 is the first Heritage Foundation mandate for leadership. And this presidential election seemed to be the first time that it at least caught my attention being used as some kind of like, I got a plan for that prop. I found that my liberal news sources were really focusing on particular topics that I think were rallying the base, rightly so. My conservative news source places were doing very similar things, focusing on very different topics that would rally their base. I figured if it's 900 pages long, there's got to be more stuff going on in there. So I started looking at it and I realized I am more of a talker to process. I know, big news flash for everyone. So then I recruited friends and friends recruited friends to read chapters with me. And so I have read the whole thing. They do not have to do that because I love them. And we are talking about what each department, bureau, or agency is supposed to do, because there's a lot of them that I'd never even heard of. Then what the Heritage Foundation suggestions are to do to those groups, which follow some pretty simple yet consistent baselines throughout the whole book. And then when we have a conversation with the person who read the chapter, what other chapters said about that particular bureau or department, and then what can we do about it at home. So this is the very first video kicking it off, and there will be 30 videos, one per chapter, and then one more, which is Onward, which is kind of the concluding look to the future. The whole point of this is to try to both demystify it and make it a little bit more accessible about what are we talking about and what is going on. As someone who thought I knew a lot about the government and I thought I knew a lot about politics and legislation, I have learned a ton. And so I just want to put out there that like I didn't know what I didn't know, and I even was cocky enough to think I knew a lot. I also really want to share that it has also been a very unexpected source of hope for me. And maybe that's just me trying to be charitable, but there's different aspects of each chapter that I'm highlighting that I'm finding hopeful that little element is included, or that little element is not included. So that's kind of my overarching what are we doing. But today we are talking about the opening material of the book, which normally I probably wouldn't have even included, except there's such good stuff in there that we decided to. So the opening section is the contents, which is a table of contents, the acknowledgments, the Project 2025 Advisory Board, the Presidential Transition Project, and the note for Project 2025, a list of all the authors and contributors, and then a foreword, which is the promise to America, which are the four main promises. So I want our panelists to be able just to quickly introduce yourselves if you're interested in kind of which pieces you read or were interested in. And then we're going to toss it to Florida Rising, which has been the testing ground for a lot of the material that's in it. So Dion, since you read the forewords, we're going to probably end the conversation with a conversation about that. Why don't we start with you for introductions, go to Michelle, and then to Letitia.
Thank you, Jessica. Hello, everyone. My name is Dion Mack. I am a leadership consultant and coach located in Georgia, just outside of Atlanta. And as Jess said, I had the honor of reading the foreword, which kind of sets the stage for the rest of the document.
Great. Michelle?
I am Michelle Ritchie. I am a professor of sociology at Lone Star College, Montgomery in Texas, the Woodlands, but north of Houston. And I read the chapter on Homeland Security, but I also looked at some of the authors and have been keeping track of who's been named to what, because there's some overlap with the upcoming cabinet and appointments.
Yes. Yes. Thank you very much, Letitia.
Yeah, hi, I'm Letitia Harmon. I am the Senior Director of Policy and Research for Florida Rising. Florida Rising is a statewide nonpartisan political nonprofit, of course, in Florida. And since Florida is the testing ground for a lot of the ideas that are in Project 2025, I was the co-author of a report, Project 2025 is Florida 2024, which I will be discussing on this call.
Perfect. Well, we can totally dive right in because that's literally the next starting place. I will add, just because I promised her I would, I just got off a Zoom call with Stephanie Bellerman, who is the person who introduced me to you, which I had no idea was going to be connected to an amazing report. Link below. Please download this report. And Stephanie says hello. So there, I kept my promises. Okay, Letitia, can you just pretend we are the dumbest of the dumbest? And I'm only saying we because I have lots of personalities. Okay. So, like, Florida 2024. If you said that to me, that makes me think of a governor wearing interesting shoes who did lots of conservative things, and most of which, like, barely passed or failed by just initiatives I might have liked more failed by just a little bit. But when I read your report, which again, link below, highly recommend. When I read your report, what I like about it, one, is very accessible. It is also very well written, and someone used an editor and a spell check. You might want to rent that person out to Project 2025. But it also takes communities and community initiatives and threads it through all of our lives and not just the key words that are being kind of mentioned. So I felt like it wasn't tokenizing or pandering to particular communities, but how this has all been a testing ground for really an ideology or an agenda. So I'm going to shut up and eat popcorn. Please download your genius and tell us what we don't know.
Thanks for that lead in, Jess. And yeah, one of the goals that I have really is to make sure that the language is as accessible as possible. I really think that one of my primary roles as a policy director is to translate really wonky, inaccessible bill language into how it impacts everyday people. I think that that is the importance of folks who do policy work, is we are actually interpreters of language that is not written to be understood by the general public, right? It's opaque on purpose. And one of the things that you find in Florida, of course, is that we are the testing ground for a lot of the furthest right wing ideas that they throw out there. Us in Florida, we kind of, swap off, or us in Texas, excuse me, I'm in Florida. Texas and Florida swap off these bad ideas that they come up with. And so a lot of this legislation that I'm going to talk about is directly connected to the leadership of Project 2025 in some way, primarily the Heritage Foundation. A lot of our bills were just directly written by the Heritage Foundation and then introduced by Republicans in the state legislature in Florida. So to Jess's point, yes, we have a governor who is well known to most of the United States, Governor Ron DeSantis, known for his vitriol against working class people, against LGBTQ folks, and for his failed bid to become the Republican candidate for president. Now, it is true that some of his priorities have either been narrow wins or they have been struck down because they are unconstitutional. One of the characterizations of a lot of Ron DeSantis' signature legislation is that he knows it's unconstitutional. He knows that it will be struck down as unconstitutional, but they pass it anyway, and they use it as a political talking point. Unfortunately, there is a lot of stuff in this report, however, that did not pass by a thin margin. It passed by very clear party lines. And while I am certainly not working for the Democrat Party, nor is my organization part of the Democrat Party, what we have in Florida is a pretty clear delineation of camps, and we have a Republican Party who has pledged allegiance to the right-wing extremists, and that is the legislation that they support. So that legislation usually passes by large numbers along party lines. We do have a Republican supermajority in the Florida state legislature, and so most of the stuff I'm going to talk about, it actually did not squeak by. It passed significantly. Now, that said, once DeSantis lost his bid for the Republican candidacy for president, he also lost a lot of influence over the Florida state legislature. And that following session, we saw a lot of bills die or get really diluted that would have otherwise sailed straight through because DeSantis wanted it and everybody was afraid to stand up to him. What happened as his power diminished is we actually saw some of those bills get killed in the Senate. And so that was one positive that came about. We identified like I said, looking at these bills, these are all directly tied back to Project 2025 in some way. And they are all part of the priorities that Project 2025 wants for the entire United States, but they're kind of been testing it in Florida. So that's why we called it the laboratory. And to your point, Jess, about how well written this report is, I need to give a shout out to the people who co-authored it with me, Jackson Oberlink and Nadeska Concha, who are from Florida for All. And they, and Nadeska especially was the final hands on this, and she's really the one who made it so readable and also so beautiful. If you go to the website, you'll see just how attractive the design is. We identified over 100 bills that had that direct tie to Project 2025. We zeroed in on 12 and called them the Dirty Dozen as kind of, these are specific examples. And these are things that they were actually able to do, right? There were others besides that were written by the Heritage Foundation or by some other hate groups that in that session after DeSantis failed his campaign to become president, didn't pass, such as the trans erasure bill, which would have made it illegal for trans people to get state issued IDs with their correct gender on them. So bills like that we managed to kill after DeSantis lost some of his power. But those bills also tie directly back to Project 2025. So some of the things that you'll see on there, I'm not going to go through executive summary and the methodology if you want to look at it. Also the organizations that I know folks on this call are going to talk about. So let me just talk about specifically highlighting some of the things they did. One of the words that you need to know if you're doing legislative work in Florida is preemption. Now, preemption just means that a higher level of government prevents a lower level of government from doing something. And in our case, that means that usually it's the state government is keeping local government, which in Florida tends to be more progressive than the state, from doing something. So they'll do things like preempt climate legislation, preempt fair living wages for workers. So if there are local protections protecting a living wage, those are made illegal by the state. And the state says, hey, we're the only ones who can pass a minimum wage, for example. It impacts housing and affordability. There was a preemption that wiped out all local tenants' bill of rights that we had worked to pass, so that only the state can actually pass any legislation that has to do with the landlord-tenant relationship. So that's very characteristic of legislation in Florida. The other things that they are consistently doing is undermining the right to vote. And they do that a lot by attacking organizations like mine or like League of Women Voters who register voters. They added a whole bunch of additional hoops to jump through and massive fines if you make any kind of like clerical error in helping register voters, which intimidated a lot of people out of doing third-party voter registration work because they were just afraid the state was going to come after them with these huge fines. So that is one of the things that Project 2025 has jumped up and they helped pass here. Of course, attacks on education, the Florida book bans are famous, and all of the ways that they have tried to undermine honest academic work and course development around sexism, racism, sexual orientation, or gender identity. They've tried to remove all of that from any educational materials in state-funded schools. Beyond that, there's of course been the expansion of access to firearms in Florida, which is of course a high priority for Project 2025. We've seen the undermining of DEI initiatives and actually attacking schools that receive funding state funding and that have DEI programs, including universities. We've also seen a very here in Florida, we're the Sunshine State. We are at the nexus of a housing crisis and a climate crisis. Our disasters are getting worse. Our housing is getting more expensive. Our property insurance has quadrupled since I've moved here. And yet the way that they go about this is they keep giving these massive cash handouts to utility companies who just keep hiking up utility rates and who are reinvesting in fossil fuels rather than actually moving towards solar power and solar energy, which is what the Sunshine State should obviously be focusing on. And then, of course, you see the attacks on immigrant families and the vilifying of people who move to Florida for a better life, which is, of course, part of Project 2025's talking point. Part of the right wing's talking points is making immigrants the boogeyman in everything bad that's happening in America. We've definitely seen that in Florida, and they actually made it for anyone to drive an undocumented person into Florida. So if you are driving the car and the person in your car happens to be undocumented, you can be felonized by the state of Florida. For a while, that bill said that you would be a felon if you lived in a house with an undocumented person, meaning that a child who is an American citizen might have an undocumented parent. They would be felonized by the state of Florida simply by virtue of living with that person. Now, fortunately, we got that part of the bill taken out before it finally passed, but it was still, a massive FU to immigrant families in the state, and was intended to be that. So the bill did eventually pass and has really impacted how safe immigrants feel in the state. So that's kind of the overall view is that, like, Florida, yeah, we are aware they try out some of their worst ideas. I can tell you that life is miserably worse since I moved to Florida from Kansas City. Just in these, 4 years, it is more expensive. The disasters are worse. It is, we have had 16% of LGBTQ plus families have left the state of Florida because they are not safe here. I have personally had friends who had to move out of the state because their job of giving counseling to trans teens literally became illegal and they had to go seek employment elsewhere. So that's these are the kind of conditions that we're already seeing in Florida that have really been cultivated over the past 5 years, is really when they've dug in and tried to pass the most egregious of these bills. And what's scary about this is that what Florida is currently, which is not affordable, attacking historically marginalized communities, trying to do away with DEI, is their vision for the entire United States. So that's the flag of warning that I have to offer to everybody else. In one sense, it's too late for us until we actually organize the fascism out of Florida. But this is the world that you're looking at for all 50 of the US states if they actually do implement the projects that they presented in Project 2025.
That is a phenomenal overview, and I completely can attest to all of that being accurate. The only piece that I would say that I don't remember specifically being mentioned in Project 2025, the document, I'm sure it's related, and protecting the constitutional right to freedom of speech, right to bear arms, etc., it would make sense. I was stunned about firearms. You had mentioned that. I was stunned that I would have thought that would have been pages and pages and pages and pages and pages, and the ATF gets a 1-sentence shout out, and that's it, which I thought was it was unexpected to me. Go ahead.
And that's fair. And as clarification, if I said it was within Project 2025, that was inaccurate. It's more to say that this is a priority of the organizations that are part of Project 2025, the big Second Amendment rights groups that make up the leadership in the committees. We know that this is a priority for them. But yes, forgive me if I misspoke on it being actually part of the document.
Oh, no, good. I'm just trying to role model what fact checking looks like. Thought I'd give it a whirl. It's fantastic. Thank you so much. Again, the link to the whole report will be right underneath this video. So thank you again. Okay, so now Project 2025 is a document that has been put together by a bunch of people. So we're going to switch over to Michelle, who has done a deep dive on both the advisory board and the authors. So I don't even know how to set you up because I can't imagine what kind of rabbit holes you did. So I'm just going to shut up and turn it over to you. Michelle, tell us about the advisory board and the authors and the people who are willing to put their names on the document and or their particular articles. Otherwise, I can start off with my thoughts about them as a collective.
That's what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to find where I put all my research, but for some reason I'm not being able to connect to my work drive for some reason, which has never happened before.
Fascinating. It's because the conspiracy theorists know what we're doing. Would
Right.
it be helpful for me to give kind of my overall impressions? And then if you can't find it, we can just talk generally about your impressions.
Yes.
I don't want you to have to panic.
Yeah, I'm kind of panicking, but you know, it's okay.
Okay. Well, no need to panic. You're not getting paid for this. It's all volunteer. So I will say one of the things that very much surprised me about who some of the people are is, first off, some of them have been around since 1979. They have written for this project or they've worked with the Heritage Foundation and whatever kind of materials it's producing since being so angry at the progressive movements of Carter when he was a president. Some of them still there. That was interesting. It's also interesting to me that some of the authors are the nominees for that particular department. So it's kind of like a shopping list. Some of the nominees or the department head appointments were names that I hadn't heard of. And it wasn't until I was reading through the chapters that I was like, why do I know this name? So I started like cross-referencing, and every day new appointments and new nominees were coming out. And so, if anything, I would say what an interesting way to organize a particular group's agenda by like, here's a person that could potentially do this. So it really did become kind of a grocery list.
Mhm.
It is also the case that very few of the writings cross-reference each other. So they talk about other departments, but they didn't actually co-collaborate and write about an initiative they're sharing together. They just point fingers. We're going to dissolve this one except for this piece, but we're going to put this piece over in this department. But then when you read that department's chapter, it doesn't even mention it or know that that's inbound. That was surprising to me, but I think that's just because I'm like a writer who can project manage. Ultimately, I would say probably my biggest takeaway from this number of people invested in collating it together. I think it's important that there's a lot of ideas that Project 2025 is a single policy agenda. And it's an organization. It read to me like an organization's collective of articles. So think of it like a very long magazine of a bunch of articles that are generally facing the same target audience, but it's not a collective written piece, which probably only matters to fellow condescending liberal people who have written before. But I was surprised by that. I really was surprised by that. What I'm assuming you haven't found your file, so I apologize for putting you on the spot. Do you have overall thoughts about what you remember about the advisors or the authors that you can share before we move on to Dion?
No, it was basically, and this is the spreadsheet I'm trying to find, in keeping track with who's been nominated or appointed or is listed as being or has been named or announced for the upcoming administration. You know, every time a new name gets announced, I've been looking, and you're right, like this is an administration of Project 2025 contributors. And the thing that you just said about the not talking to each other, I also noticed that it's very siloed in terms of who wrote what and who commented on what. And that's one of the things I found most confusing, that these people who have never talked to each other, apparently from reading the work, are now going to be working, some of them very closely together. And I'm wondering, how those conversations are going to go, because some of the information, depending on which section of it that you're reading, doesn't necessarily support action being done in some of the other sections. And so that's kind of one of the things that I was trying to keep track of, is kind of the who wrote what, but also now where are they within this upcoming administration, or are they connected via other people to this upcoming administration? And the only thing that I can remember from my spreadsheet, I guess we can film this section again, but the only thing I remember from my spreadsheet is there are a lot of overlaps.
Mm-hmm. There are an extraordinary amount of overlaps, and we're probably not going to film the section again because I'm not going to invest the time and energy to edit all this stuff. But we can share the link to the spreadsheet, or I can upload it as a PDF, assuming you ever find it. So we can all look forward to that. How's that?
Yes.
Okay. You keep looking on the off chance that you find it, because I've known you for 100,000 years, and there are some factoids and trivia pieces that are in this spreadsheet that are going to make everybody very excited. So while that is kind of looking, then Dion, let's go to you next. So like any good sliver of tree that looks like a book, there is a foreword, a beginning piece. And the beginning piece is really supposed to set the tone for the book. I have published several books, and for me, forewords are always actually kind of hard, because when I write a foreword, I kind of always just, can you just read the book? Like, why do I have to give you the introduction to the introduction? Just turn the page and start reading the book. That's what I want to say as an author. This particular foreword, though, it's not very long. It's longer than I would have expected, but not that long compared to some of the chapters. But mostly it just lays out the 4 promises. So you volunteered to read this part because you're a masochist. So before we get to the 4 promises, can you share just some of your overall thoughts of it setting the tone for what's going? Like, now we've heard about Florida, we know who's kind of involved. So setting the tone for someone who might possibly be reading this book cover to cover. Can you talk a little bit about what you thought it was going to be like, what it was like in reality, and what you learned?
So what I thought it was going to be like, I'm going to tell you, Jess, I don't know that I had a full picture or idea of what I thought it was going to be like. I had heard about Project 2025. I had, read op-eds on it, watched a bunch of different commentators kind of analyze it, but did not sit down and read it myself. And I will tell you, when I volunteered to take the forward, I was not sure what I was getting myself into. But as I started reading it, what struck me initially, a couple of things. First, the Heritage Foundation taking the lead on this, and their history in the past in setting legislation and kind of taking the lead with the Conservative Party as far as thinking back to the 80s and Reaganomics.
Setting Reagan up.
Exactly. And what struck me most was their intentionality and their planning. They've been working on this document since 2022, thinking about all that Letitia said and how they kind of, let's pilot some of these things first and see how things are going to play out. What initially struck me the most was their intentionality. Mm-hmm. And then as I started reading, he talked about the 4 promises. They laid this out very simply as this is our vision for restoring America. And their 4 fronts on face value, not all 4 of them, but they don't. Okay, some of them sound like, you know what, this makes sense. It could be, I see how people can get behind them, some of them, when they don't know exactly what is intended for. Like, if you hear just the title of the 4 promises or the 4 focus areas for this large document that's supposed to take care of all of the nation's ills and how they break it down into these 4 areas, if you don't read it and if you don't deep dive, I see how some people can say, yeah, this makes sense. I can get behind this. That's what kind of struck me next. And then even in reading the foreword, as they broke down the very high level, the 4 focus areas, a lot of questions. Even though it comes across as very simple, and meant to unify. There are a lot of red flags in this. I'm curious to hear, because I did not read the whole thing. So when you talked about being hopeful, I'm looking forward to hearing about what you're hopeful about in this, because there are a lot of red flags even in the forward that popped up for me.
So let's first, just so people are like, what is happening? Number one, when you are like a manic depressive and have a lot of anxiety and are really worried about the future of the entire world and all of the people that I know and don't know, any little glimmer of hope, I'm looking for it. So I just want to put that out there, okay? On one of the recordings that I recorded yesterday, I described it as a like little rhinestone gem that fell out of the little pouch at Michael's and got stuck to like the grocery cart wheel, and you find it in the parking lot in the rain by your door. Like, that's a glimmer of hope to me. Okay. So let's monitor expectations about what source of hope means. But with those expectations, there are things in it that I am very surprised are in it, right? So like one, for example, is obvious. Well, we're getting to the promises, so I'm just going to use this as an example to kind of temper people what my expectations of hope might mean. It is obviously very, very, very clear that anything having to do with abortion has to go. Technically speaking, because of Dobbs, that is legally correct, right? So like, we're not talking about a political agenda that's anti-abortion at this point. It is actually looking at the legislation or the policies on state or federal levels that now that's what we're supposed to be doing, right? So let's just hold that. However, it specifies that miscarriage treatment and ectopic pregnancy health care should never be conflated with abortion care. Now, I'm not going to lie, this
In the
document,
document? Okay.
yeah, I had to reread it like 18 times to make sure I was still somehow in the right file. But to be so, to my ears, that like not understanding how pregnancy works, not understanding women's health care, anything related to abortion is trivialized because the importance is life begins at conception, at a heterosexual marriage of a man who is a breadwinner. It even specifies we don't even like boyfriends. We like breadwinner cisgender men who are in a heterosexual Christian marriage with a cisgender woman who conceived those babies. Side note, adoption matters, but I don't know how that works with conception and that family. Like, that is such a rigid explanation that for a sentence to be left in, right? Like, they could have used an editor, but for a sentence to be left in that miscarriages and ectopic pregnancy treatment should never be conflated with abortion care that should be eradicated. That to me is a glimmer of hope, because I was 100% not prepared for that to be in the document, and it was. So fascinating. Here we go. That's what I mean by hope, right? It's inside of something that's really frightening to me. I am going to find something. And I found something in almost every chapter that was kind of like, oh, that is an interesting little twist. But I'm looking for something to be charitable or to be able to see some progress. And possibly this is because, and Michelle, you and I haven't talked about this, but we've been friends for so long. But I ran LGBT centers during Bush. And so I've done 2 Bush and a Trump, and this is the second Trump. And so I think there's also, I talked to a bunch of my friends who also used to run LGBT centers back when it was still illegal to be gay. And most of us kind of have a feeling of, all right, let's buckle up and do this again and see how this can work again. And if I'm entering this project with that bias, for lack of better words, maybe I'm looking for the hope so that I can actually kind of keep doing the work. But it also kept me doing the work when I needed to keep doing the work when everybody else wasn't hopeful. So it's kind of a learned skill. Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk about hope. I also would never have expected I would be the source of a TED Talk for hope, but here goes nothing. So thank you for volunteering, even if you didn't know what you were getting into. But what did you take from the foreword, or do we just want to jump into the 4 promises?
Well, first I want to say that that example that you gave, even talking about the abortion rights, that was one thing that popped out for me. So when I said I can't wait to hear about what you're hopeful about, you helped even in that second, because one of the things that popped out, and they talked in there about how they need to ardently pursue their pro-life and their pro-family policies, recognizing, and I can't remember exactly how they put it, but recognizing the impact, you know, where there may be tragic situations that women may find themselves in. And I knew in that moment they were talking about, for example, ectopic pregnancies, or, you know, pregnancies that came as a result of rape or incest or what have you, or just, you know, medical issues that really would require termination. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're saying we're going to recognize this, but not do anything about it potentially. So for them to call that out, again, I didn't go through the whole document, so that's awesome. And I do believe that even thinking back on the past, we've made it through, and there's always opportunity. So I can appreciate your hopefulness. The 4 promises, again, very simple, laid out as very simple areas: restoring the family, centering the family as the centerpiece of American life and society. But then what comes up from and protecting our children. So that's that first promise: restoring the family as the centerpiece of the nation and protecting our children. But how do they define family? You know, they talk about this as being, you know, how we're going to unify the nation, but I have a lot of questions. It comes across as being very divisive, or potentially at least being very divisive, right? How do they define family? And what does this mean for those that don't conform to their definition of what a family is? What are they protecting our children from? And of all the things that I can think of our children need protecting from, what they call out are transgenders, as like, this is what we need to protect our children from. Leaving out a whole bunch of other things that we can all think of, you know, poor educational system, unequal access to healthcare, you know, gun violence, all the things that we would think about. All they talk about is we have to protect our children from pornography and, you know, the corruption that could come from our trans citizens. So very, very exclusionary vision in my thoughts around protecting the family and protecting our children. The second promise is around dismantling the administrative states. They talk about the overreach of the government and just how conflated it has become, and how we need to return the power back to what the Constitution says, where the Constitution says the power should be. So staying with Congress, they're looking at getting rid of, for all intents and purposes, at least the way it's laid out in the forward, getting rid of all the administrative bodies that work to enforce and translate all the policies and legislation that's put into place. And leaving that work to the legislators themselves. So the accountability is back to where they say it's supposed to be and with the people. The third promise is around, it's talking about our sovereignty as a nation, so returning our sovereignty. And what came out, they talk a lot about China, and, you know,
a lot about China.
Yeah, it is like, we're not talking about, you know, limiting the impact or the influence of China. They're like, we need to just dismantle, stop it altogether. And it almost comes across as wanting to isolate the United States from, you know, I question or wonder what is this going to do for globalization and the interconnectedness of our world, innovation, global collaboration. Technology is not going anywhere. They talk as if America is the source of all this innovation that's happening globally, when that's not necessarily the case. And we need to be connected. And this comes, like, they talk a lot about wanting to pull away from treaties and parties and agreements. So you think about NATO and things like that. Very, very, it comes across as wanting to pull ourselves away from the global economy versus being a part of the global economy. And then that last one is around restoring our individual rights. And I just wonder, it just kind of sounds like the wild, wild west to me, you know. So if we have these, if we are restoring individual rights and our pursuit to happiness, our right to liberty, our individual rights to liberty, what does that mean though? Because the next, everyone should be free to be who they are. that to me conflicts with what they're saying, even with the first promise of restoring the family. All of this, there's this unifying aspect, but this very exclusionary aspect, and I'm just not sure how they could have put this all together.
Honestly, you nailed it. I think that if I were to think about the entire document, it's not just hypocrisy. It is also using words in a way that is not what that word means. So like one of my favorite phrases that will come up in multiple chapters is, get a pen, nonpartisan civil servants who are loyal to the president's agenda. Like, that's not what that word means. Like, I thought, what? Also, leftist, extremist, Marxist agenda. What do you think those leftist, extremist, Marxists like me are going to do when we are co-celebrating getting out of the IMF and the WTO? We're getting out, very different reasons, but like, we could all be wearing the same shirt. I'm waiting for their heads to implode. There's so many times where this like level of, and I really honestly, like, I mean, I'm new to most of y'all. Who, anybody watching this video, you should go do whatever it is you're procrastinating. But if you are familiar with me, I try really, really hard to like, okay, what are they trying to say? Where do I agree with them? Not as a minimization, but as a point of entry so that we can actually engage in a conversation. What do we agree with? Fantastic. This thing is supposed to be laying out its thoughts to me. So then I am fully open to, I might not even have thoughts yet. So let me see what your thoughts are. So if we can figure out what we agree with, then we can figure out what we disagree with. I am not minimizing the actual harm that's going to come out of a lot of these policies. I am not minimizing the actual harm that has already come out of these policies in Florida and elsewhere. I am also very mindful that it's very easy for someone with my privilege to say, well, you know, we survived the first Trump presidency, because not everyone survived the first Trump presidency. So I am entering with a level of curiosity and respect to see, what the hell is this thing? Like, I really, truly, I didn't want to be guided by my own echo chamber, and I wanted to find out what this was for myself. So I did, and I got some questions. I am left with more questions than I am resolve or answers. And the hope, look, here I did it again. A lot of the questions are, for example, if on day one, you're going to quit anything Biden did. Okay, let's just say, okay, great. You don't know where that's located because it's day one. So you're going to need senior officer people to physically tell you where that filing cabinet is and what the copy code is, right? Like, I have been fired a lot. That is probably not surprising to a lot of people. But day one at a new job, like, you are navigating a lot of office culture. You got to figure out which bathroom you're allowed to poop in, which one you're allowed to pee in. How do you make photocopies? Who's going to fix this coffee machine? So that day, we're going to eradicate every Biden initiative. And then I'm assuming after somebody points them all out, then that's when we're going to fire all of them, because that's also supposed to happen on day one, right? Like, there's a performative piece. And frankly, maybe it's because I'm a DEI speaker consultancy person. I'm so used to the performance of, we're going to do this. And you're like, okay, I'll be back. You know, like, everything is so much slower to roll out that it was oddly hope making that the absurdity that day one these things could be happening. That is paired with, though, Reagan initiated about 50%, according to this document. Reagan initiated about 50% of the mandate for leadership during his first year in president. First year is not first day. Just want to point that out. There's 364, maybe 5, depending on the year going on it. Okay, then Trump, according to this document, says that Trump implemented 64% of the mandate for leadership in his first year. And of course, he was very proud about this because it's more than Reagan. Okay, also, not a single footnote in sight. So I don't know if that's true. I don't know how you would even measure that. There's so many contradictory wishes that I don't know which one would be implemented. But if you're counting like a checkbox list, if they contradict each other, you can't do both of them, right? Because that's other thing I would say overarching is I live on the ocean. I live on a cliff on the ocean, and we have a lot of Coast Guard presence here. And I've never lived anywhere that had a lot of Coast Guard presence. But I'm just going to throw out that Coast Guard is being shoved around this document. Nobody knows where it's supposed to live. Nobody really knows what it does. People keep adding jobs to it. I wouldn't be surprised if it showed up in the Department of Education. Like almost every chapter is like, I don't know, give it to the Coast Guard. But that became kind of a metaphor, and it made me feel a little better of like, I don't know, freedom of choice, right? Like I default to freedom of choice. I don't know. What is interesting is small business, free market economies also say that they default to freedom of choice. So now we're back to Antifa and Heritage Foundation agreeing with each other. There's so many of those moments that I don't know how it could actually be implemented in the way that literally we are being talked to about it. Euphemistically and agenda wise, we've seen it in Florida. It absolutely can happen, but it feels more. Letitia, please jump in and disagree with me if you'd like. But in reading that document and reading this document basically at the same time and kind of like having these thoughts at the same time, to me, what 64% implementation might actually mean is that what we had never questioned before as like decorum or just kind of what we do with the president has never been written down. It was not a custom it was norms that like this, okay, I guess is what we're going to do now, right? But to shift the culture of what is acceptable and what is shocking, like I'm not daring anybody, but like I ran out of shock, I think, in like the first months of Trump's presidency, and I had 4 years and a global pandemic still to get through. So that is definitely been an effective culture shift where the audacity to implement these specifics, I think, is almost less important. And I'm probably saying that as a very privileged person. When you articulate the promises, some of this is very clearly defined, but most of it is. But Dion, when you were talking about it, it made me think of like I'm not a cook, so just bear with me. But like when you're for New Year's, I made celery sticks and dip. This is my level of cooking. And so while I was cutting the celery sticks, some of the celery sticks didn't look right. Right? They have like little leafy bits or weird divots, or they were like too yellow and not green enough, whatever. I made up a rubric of which celery bits were going to make it on the tray or not. And I think when you were talking, I thought of the celery is that we are focusing on a Christian, biblical based heterosexual family that has conceived its own children.
And has access to wealth.
Or at least the aspiration to, right? I would actually say that not having access to wealth just is a celery stalk that got cut off the cutting board. It's just wealthy enough, has means. The man is the breadwinner. The woman does not need to do that. And in the same chapter would talk about senior care. Child care should be in the home, right? Like to me, taking care of your parents, like sandwich generation, that's like a progressive idea that you're thinking about. And then the next sentence is childcare, it doesn't need to be globally provided because it should just be in the home, right? Like the whiplash between the two I could focus on that part, or I could focus on this kind of, and this is Dion, what you made me think of. It's like a weaning down of the celery bits that didn't make the cut. That is a horrible way to talk about people that I would belong to. But what's left, this cream of the crop, generally, to Michelle's point, wealthy, Christian, able-bodied white people who are conceiving their own children, those people will feel like they have more choices. Those people
Yes.
will have the health care that they need.
Mhm.
As soon as that shifted in my head, you know, like my therapist, because I had 2 therapy appointments while doing this, my therapist said that I turned off MSNBC and I just started reading the document, right? So like as soon as I realized that it's a culling and then the aspiration is for this culled group to feel a certain way, it made a little bit more sense. I don't agree with it, but it made a little bit more sense. Michelle, did you by chance find your fancy spreadsheet?
No, and the IT person that I was talking to
There's
isn't helpful.
deep over there.
But I did want to say one thing.
Yep.
And it kind of piggybacks on what you were talking about. I think the brilliance of this document, this movement, this Project 2025 is in those 4 promises. They're vague enough so that everybody can see themselves in those promises. But you're right, those promises are just for a certain group of people. And that's one of the things too, in terms of looking at who was involved in this project and now who's getting involved in the administration. These are not people who have ever had to struggle in the sense of, they may want, one of the parents in a family might want to stay home, but they can't afford it, right? These people are trying, the people who are involved, they don't think about that. They're saying, oh yeah, restore the family as the centerpiece of American life and protect our children, while at the same time, getting rid of a lot of the support that would, and preventing a lot of the support that would allow that to happen. I mean, if most of the research shows that in families, yeah, they want, they think somebody staying home raising the kids would be amazing. A lot of times they can't do it, so it's not a value thing, it's a practicality thing. And that's the piece that's missing from the communication, is people aren't seeing the lack of practicality because they're buying into the overall message, and they're not asking the question, but wait, whose children are we protecting? Who's going to be the center? Who are we looking to have this be the centerpiece of life? Because it's not us, because we can't do these things, because you're taking away our resources, and you're making it harder to do these things. And yet, but I still believe in that value, and it's that disconnect. I think that's the brilliance of this, because I don't doubt that they know what they're doing. I think that's been our problem for a long time. They know what's going to happen when they implement some of these things, but they're still able to sell it in a way that makes it seem like they are looking out for everybody. But we need to keep asking the questions of, well, who, right? Which American people are we talking about?
Who's everybody? Which everybody?
Right. They're not including them in terms of how to achieve these things. And that's kind of looking at the people who are involved, coming from religious backgrounds, coming from corporate backgrounds. The American people that they're talking about are like corporate people. They're not talking about the American people who are trying to live off of minimum wage, right? And can't afford to buy a house. They're not talking about them, because those people, they're perfectly fine with having their families torn apart and having their kids go into the mines, and because they're dismantling protections for children in work, things like that. Like that's not good for centering the family, like, right? In terms of making
but
the
it's
kids
not
go
their
out and work.
family.
Right,
Yeah,
but it's not their family.
Right.
And so
It's
that's
just like
how they're able to,
not everybody has to go to college, but they don't
right.
mean their family members don't have to go to college. Yeah.
Right.
Sorry, great point, Michelle.
To continue your cooking metaphor a bit, Jess, it's That, well, and
I love that chopping celery has elevated to cooking.
here
I
we
have
are.
no.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what they're doing
Perfect.
is like, if you're bringing a dish to the family gathering and somebody asks you what you're bringing, you're like, oh, it's a potato and cheese casserole. You don't sit there and give the recipe and respond to that, right? So what they're presenting here is, hey, we're bringing you a potato and cheese casserole. I love that. They know what the recipe is, but they're not offering the recipe
Right.
to the people. And so let's say like someone out there is like, okay, but I have an onion allergy. Are there onions in it? And they're like, we're not telling you that here. Like you just have to eat it and find out if you go into anaphylactic shock, right? And I think really the answer is to that family model that you described, that vision of family only works if you have inherited wealth, right, Jess? Like not
Mhm.
like mom stays home and doesn't work. Like in literally what family is that possible? In family
Right.
inherited wealth. That's really it. Nobody else has access to this vision of family. Nobody else can just like take care of grandpa and grandma in, excuse me, another wing of the house that, of course, a working class family doesn't have. And so they're telling you this wonderful aspirational world that you're like, I would like it if my parents could like live with me and age with me with grace and dignity and have family be there. And nobody has asked them, okay, but how? What's the recipe? Show me the recipe for how that happens, because I can't do it. I have to work. And how are my parents going to have care while I'm at work? You know, so that's, I think, just the overall of this whole thing is like they're telling you, I'm bringing you potato and cheese casserole. Great, but what's in it? We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to actually like explain the recipe to you because we're worried that you're going to ask about specific ingredients that you don't like. And yeah, it's really that vision of family is really only accessible to folks who have privilege and inherited wealth and nobody else, but everybody else aspires to that. And so they do hope that's what their life could look like.
But then you look at their economic policies, and a lot of those
And it's
economic
not going to get them
policies
there.
yeah, it's not going to get them there.
Right.
There's a really interesting segment on that I think Stephen Colbert did on his show, where he talked about the lottery and how people, you know, despite the ridiculous amounts of odds, people keep trying to win the lottery. And he blamed it on an optimism that American people have, and it's somewhat kind of related to the idea of the American dream. Like we tell people, if you work hard enough, you can achieve these things, and that's an optimistic viewpoint of kind of how the world works, right? And we have that optimism; it's built into our culture, and so we still play the lottery, even though there's a very small chance, because you know we just think that we might be the ones that get it. And in the same way, you know, kind of when it comes to looking at these policies, right? Like, well, yeah, when I have my $1 billion, I don't want them to take money away from me. Like, we have this inherent optimism as Americans that we can become wealthy, you know, just with hard work. But the reality is we can't. And it's that optimism that is hurting us, because people aren't listening to the we can't. They would rather be optimistic. If that makes any sense.
I mean, a pretty important tenet of capitalism is the discontentment of what you don't have. So then you're constantly hungry for the growth and what other people have. And there's a slight edge that needs to be available of yearning and wanting and desiring and injustice that is present there to keep that growing motivation. And I find the same thing talking about systems of oppression, is that it is much more comfortable for me to talk about what I don't have than what I do have, and acknowledge that there are people who do not have what I have. Instead, I'm going to look and figure out what I don't have. Deanna, it looked like you were going to say something, and this is close to the final word.
Well, I was just going to chime in when Letitia and actually Michelle were talking about, you know, how we could restoring the family and how we can get behind some of this, but the taking away of resources. So when they're talking about, you know, restoring the family, we can all get behind that, but then dismantling the administrative state, then what happens to our Medicare? What happens to Social Security? What happens to public education. All of those things go away. And then so that the broader part of the American society, to your point, those who have wealth can still manage and navigate through this situation. Those who are relying on, I'm not going to say necessarily public assistance, but the things that we pay into as working class, even, they're looking to admonish and abolish all of those things. How are you going to continue? How is that family going to sustain itself when they don't have the resources that they've actually paid into over time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's being disguised again as choice. So when we
Right.
talk about like plan A, plan B, plan B is the one I like. Plan A is the one I don't like. Plan A is the idea that Medicaid or Medicare can be privatized, and it's being marketed so that people can feel that they have a choice. Some people can afford those choices. Other people cannot afford those choices, but it's being presented as better choices. Same thing with the VA, right? That VA benefits are an entitlement to people that I feel have deserved it. Just going to make that claim. And by privatizing the VA, you are asking for some people who have the means to be able to go get better care. And we're just creating more and more stratification that is benefiting the few businesses and not benefiting most of the businesses. Well, we can do this forever. And if we do too much, we're going to stroganoff our brains. And so I volunteered for stroganoff brains. You do not have to stroganoff brain yourself. But I really appreciate you setting the tone for this particular project. Letitia, thank you for everything that's happening in Florida. Dion, thank you for like jumping in with like, I don't know. And it's those eyes that I think really needed to look at those promises, and so that you could really see how they are just thunderously a baseline throughout the entire document. Michelle, thank you for the research that you did on a spreadsheet that we might eventually someday have. But I also really appreciate your perspective in bringing in the larger pictures of what it means to be competing for resources and the importance of slowing down and who's writing the definitions and what is the definition they're operating with. I think that's a really good reminder. So thank you all. Here, the kickoff video. Soon to follow will be 30 individual chapter discussions and then one called Onward, which is their conclusion for the future. So thank you very much, y'all.